Well, hello everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a Herald of Nurgle, more specifically the PoxBringer. Now, taking a look at the model, it seems pretty straightforward. I'm going to begin by clipping off all the pieces. After that, we're going to move to, studying the instruction manual, which is pretty straightforward. Then we're going to go to removing all the mold lines, and then I'm going to use some super glue with the brush head to assemble the whole thing. I'm not that much of a fan of model glue, as it seems to get messy and it just takes too long to use for my tastes. Now with some Liquitex modeling putty and some Tester's model glue, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix them in a 2 putty to 1 model glue, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix it together, and then I'm going to brush it on, splotch it onto the smooth areas for texturing, but I'm also going to take my synthetic brush and I'm going to paint it into the recesses. I want to fill in the gaps. I don't want any exposed gaps on this. I also wanted to try something different for the plague sword that he has. I wanted to add texture to it, so I was going to brush on this texture up and down all along the blade to give this runny, rusted, like cast iron effect. Now, getting some green stuff, what we're going to do is we're going to make a very thin string of green stuff. And we're going to use this to make some maggots, some noticeably larger maggots. I then apply the little pieces of green putty randomly to the body using super glue, and these are going to be the maggots. I attach the model to a board using tape for easy holding, and now I'm going to prime it. I use Bright Touch General Spray Primer. It's a car primer. It has a very strong grip and works very well and shows off all the detail. Now I coat the base in more Liquitex putty, and when it dries partially towards the top and it's still soft, I take the dried model, who's also just been primed, and I continuously press it in so it makes an indent into the putty, so there's a seamless transition from the base to the model. Now using yellow ochre ink, I'm going to use this as the first layer to be the underlayer for the shadows and the depth. Now I'm going to use an off-white pallid witch flesh, and I'm going to paint it from the raised areas using the airbrush. Now the artwork for the PoxBringer shows it as a sort of a darker tone, a bluish, dark greenish skin compared to regular plague bearers. So for the undercoat we're going to use this Druchii Violet, and we're going to spray it all over to give it a darkish tone, darkish bluish tone for the final product. Now using a bright white of White Scar, I'm going to dry brush this all over the model. However, after doing so, I probably didn't dry the paint enough in the dry brush process, and it kind of overloaded the model with too much white bright highlights, and that was too much. So then I went back with some watered down Druchii Violet and then just painted it all over to tone down the white again. Now moving on to using pastels, I'm going to start with a dark brown pastel. I'm going to grind off some with the knife, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to brush it onto the dark or the diseased areas. Basically what I'm doing is I'm going to add color using these pastels. They're not very effective, so you have to brush a lot to get deep color. So I'm going to start with a dark brown, and then I'm going to work my way up to a more bright orange, and I'm going to place that on the higher raised areas. Now with Balor Brown, we're going to use this as a base coat for all the bones and the spine. Now with Mournfang Brown, we're going to use this as the base coat for the open flesh. Now we move on to contrast paint Plaguebearer's flesh. After all the pre-coating and shading and all the color transitions with pastels and modeling and stuff, we're finally beginning to paint and add color, the main color to this. Now using Guilliman flesh, I'm going to paint over the open flesh and inside the body's cavity. Using Magos Purple, I paint all the intestines, including the ones that droop onto the base, because apparently it's dragging on the ground. Now using Skeleton Horde, I'm going to go and paint over all the bone, all the horns, the spine, and the toes, the toenails. Now, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to coat it first, and then when it dries, I'm then going to go over with a second coat over it on like a third of the way up on the horns, on the more raised areas, the higher it goes. Then when that dries, I'm going to do an even further coat on the higher areas. And basically how it's going to look is at the bottom, or where the horns are growing from, it's going to be very white or bony colored. But as they go towards the tips get dark brown and darker. So this is a process of layering multiple successive layers of Skeleton Horde on it as it goes up in height. So the tips should be dark brown and the base should be pretty bright. Now, taking a close look at the model, I noticed there's some things that I just don't like so far. Like, there's some areas that are way too bright and light, and there's some places that just don't have enough color, that just seem to be drowned out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over with Plague Bearer's Flesh over these bright areas, and I'm going to try to darken them with more Plague Bearer's Flesh with a second coat. And then I'm going to go and get my pastels, the bright orange ones, and I'm going to apply them to the diseased areas to try to brighten it up, because it just doesn't look good enough yet. Not that much distinction. I don't want a heavily bright distinction, but I want it to be noticeable, but not overpowering. Using a dark bluish purplish pastel, I'm going to use this and paint the very bright areas on the lower body and the shadows as well, and add some more tone and color to this model. Returning to Magot's purple, I'm going to use this to get a further darker coat of purple onto the intestines. It's just too bright for me, I don't like it. And then I'm going to use the paint and I'm going to cover the edges of the flesh, right where all the open sores or open wounds where it rips open. I'm going to use it to add some color for the transition, to make it stand out a bit more. Now moving on, we're going to use some Fugen Orange. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use this to further color the ripped open flesh, the skin on the edges. We're also going to use this to color parts of the face, like around the cheeks, his ears, around the eyes, give it some reddish color there. We're also going to use this to, as a first layer for all of his boils and stuff, to highlight them or cast shade. However, after doing it without using the Bestigor Flesh, which I normally have done before, it just didn't look too good. So while I'm doing it now, I'm realizing that it's just not good without the base coat of Bestigor. Using Bestigor Flesh, we're going to use this to cover all the boils to pick them out. Afterwards, then we're going to go back to Fugen Orange and then re-highlight them. I just didn't like the way it looked before. And then, once that is dry, we will then go back and then highlight finally with some more Bestigor Flesh over the highlighted areas to make it stand out better. Using Leadbelcher, I'll use this as the base coat for the sword. And then after I painted all the metal, and then I'm going to move on to a wash of Agrak's Earthshade. Now, one thing I noticed is that the texturing on the sword isn't as good as I thought it would be. I was doing up and down motions, and probably should have used a different brush. But most of the detail sticks through. Now using Riser Rust and then Nihlak. Using that oxide, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint in small areas or batches, or pick out the edges of the blade, or its many edges, with the Riser Rust, and then spread that around in an up and down motion. Now once that's dry, I'm going to go back with the oxide, and I'm basically going to put it in places where maybe the rust was too much or too overpowering. I use this basically to tone down the rust and fill out areas that are just too orange. I'm using Ushabti bone and a little bit of Lamenter's yellow mixed in. We're going to use this to paint the maggots. This is a nice off-white yellowish sickly color. We're going to use this and we're going to paint all the maggots on the model. Using Balthazar gold, I'm going to dilute it a bit with water so it becomes a little transparent, and I'm going to paint it over all the brass bells. Then I'm going to give him a wash of Agrax Earthshade to add some dirt coloring into it. Using Ushtabi bone, I'm going to use this to just perfectly pick out the eye. Finishing some details, I'm going to take some Gulliman flesh and I'm just going to coat this head in it. And then I'm going to take some Dawnstone and then I'm going to paint the stone base Dawnstone. Now for varnishing, I'm going to use AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish because it protects the model, but it does not change the painting or the paint job at all. It doesn't ruin anything, it doesn't whiten anything, it doesn't color it in any way, shape, or form. It just applies a matte finish and no discoloration or anything. Now moving on to some more details, on a step I should have done earlier but didn't, I'm using Mornfang Brown to paint these leather wraps or strips that are on its eyes and mouth. They're sewing it shut. Now moving on to Blood for the Blood God. I'm going to use this paint essentially as a mask to cover up mistakes or blend things together or add some character or uniqueness to the model. I'm going to put it on all the open sores, the flesh ripping apart, some of the open exposed flesh on the maggots especially to help them blend into their surroundings, and on various other places, around the mouth too. Now on to attaching the base. I'm going to put the model on the base, and then I'm going to drill through the bottom through it, so it hits through the foot, hit through the base to make sure it's all perfectly aligned. Then I'm going to glue in a little piece of paper clip into the hole I made, and then glue the whole base and then attach them two together, and then glue the end of the paper clip that's sticking out the bottom to make sure it's all strong and attached. Using Baylor Brown, I will now coat the base with it all around except for the stone, and I will also use this color to pick out the tiny teeth of the PoxBringer and his little Nurgling. By now the green putty has completely dried, so now I'm going to take a little razor knife and I'm going to cut spines into the maggots to add more texture, more depth, and so they don't just look like giant pieces of rice. I'm going to mix some natural umber from Vallejo pigment with some isopropyl alcohol, and I'll cover the whole base with it, even the stone. Then I'll use Liquitex matte varnish to seal the powder into the base. And now using Nurgle's Rot, we're going to use this as another mask. We're going to use this to cover up all the mistakes on the base, the bright white shiny parts. We're also going to use this to cover up certain parts of the sword and also like the maggots as well. And he is done. Now, there are a few things I did well, some things I didn't do well. I did manage to get his skin tone to be more darker. I really did well on the horns. I really liked their coloration and them leading to a dark tip. However, the maggots kind of detract from the model in the end. Not because they're there, but because they're too big. If they were about half their size, it would blend better into the model. Instead, they're kind of too big and obvious, even though I tried to make them blend in with some more Nurgle's Rot on them. If they would have been half their size, it would have been better. But the texture on the sword is actually pretty good. There's not that much, but there's just enough to make it look like it's cast iron. And apart from that, I got some good coloration on the body. The organs look good, but I did put too much pigment powder on the base, and that less is more in a way. It makes it more distinct instead of just throwing too much on. I guess I made a mistake on that. But overall, it's a pretty good project. I'm not entirely proud of it. Like, if I rate it myself, like 10 being perfectly proud of it, I'm more of a 7. But, no, well, it's a decent model. That Nurgling could have used some more distinction or stuff, but I couldn't really figure out what to do to make it stand out more from the rest of it, the model, because it just looks like a tiny green blob. Well, anyway, I guess that's the end, and I'll move on to my next project, which is a bunch of plague drones.